The year 2025 is expected to bring significant changes to the geopolitical landscape in many parts of the West and Western-aligned countries. Germany is to hold elections this year, and Chancellor Olaf Scholz is not in a generally favourable position to maintain power. Justin Trudeau, Canada's long-standing Prime Minister, has announced his resignation as the head of the Liberal Party of Canada, paving the way for his successor. Japan's Shigeru Ishiba is struggling to form a government, and South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol is trying to dodge the police carrying arrest warrants. The French government endeavours to implement reforms in the National Assembly following a no-confidence vote in December, while the establishment parties of the West anticipate, often with anxiety, President Trump's return to the White House in January. Against the backdrop of all this turmoil in the West and the world, President Emmanuel Macron of France delivered a wide-ranging New Year speech this week, demonstrating that despite all the changes in the world around him, he remains unchanged. President Macron has not concealed his confidence in himself and his ability to lead France, positioning himself in his mind as the influential leader of a unified Europe. The speech made headlines when he stated that Donald Trump knows he has a solid ally in France. He underlined that France, under his leadership, would foster cooperation between the two nations. President Macron appears to be sincere in his statement, as he extended an invitation to President-elect Trump to attend the reopening of the Notre Dame Cathedral in December. Subsequently, he arranged private meetings with President-elect Trump, in which Ukraine President Zelensky also participated. These meetings focused on discussing the ongoing war in Ukraine and his apparent support for the Trump transition team's outlined peace plan. During President Macron's address, he made a point that seems to align with the peace plan coming from the Trump team, led by retired Army Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. The US plan for Ukraine is a land for peace and security plan, which President Macron publicly endorsed. He stated that Ukraine must engage in a realistic discussion on territorial questions, acknowledging that Ukraine lacks a realistic plan to reclaim the territory that the Russians have captured. Mr. Macron also stated that Ukraine must take the lead in the negotiations for a peace with the Russians, which is an assurance that the West would not negotiate away the Ukrainian fate through some back-channel agreement. Remember the Munich Agreement in 1938. President Macron emphasized that the US plays a crucial role in these Ukraine negotiations by altering the nature of the situation and persuading Russia to engage in serious negotiations. This implies that Europe and the Ukrainians require US assistance in developing a strategy to engage the Russians in serious peace talks. He acknowledged that the incoming administration would need to engage with Russia, a departure from the current administration's policy of no diplomatic engagement, but he did not specify how the US should do this. The incoming US and French positions also hinge on Ukraine's need to negotiate with Russia and avoid falling prey to vengeful Russians. President Macron stated that, similar to the US's role with the Russians, a diplomatic victory by the US would bring an end to the war, ensuring Ukraine does not lose in the land for peace and security scenario. He also acknowledged that the Europeans play a crucial role in establishing long-term security guarantees for Ukraine, which will be the primary responsibility of the European powers. This does not necessarily imply NATO membership in Ukraine, but it could involve the deployment of peacekeepers within the country. More importantly, however, it is crucial that the Europeans establish a credible defensive deterrent to deter Russian aggression. There is no mention of the specifics, but potential measures could include arming and training Ukraine and Europe, maintaining a credible armed force, and establishing defensive infrastructure to counter any Russian aggression in Ukraine or other parts of European NATO. For this to be successful, President Macron stated that Europe and the US must not allow war fatigue to force an inadequate peace in Ukraine. He further stated that peace in Ukraine is only a step, and Europe must prepare its defences to meet the deterrent and security requirements needed to stop Russian aggression. This also aligns closely with President Trump's policy of sharing the burden. This does not mean France will be a compliant ally to the incoming administration, as it was not under the first Trump administration. Mr. Macron has advocated for a European defence industry that is not dependent on US weapon manufacturing to meet European security requirements, which would also encompass an arms industry in Ukraine. Despite not explicitly stating it, Mr. Macron has been advocating for this position since 2023, driven by his dissatisfaction with the notion that the most powerful military force in Europe and European affairs is not European, but American. Mr. Macron is seizing this opportunity to collaborate with the upcoming administration to align US and French short-term goals towards achieving peace in Ukraine, which is a positive objective. This does not imply that French and US policies will always align in the long term, as Mr. Macron intends to decrease US presence and influence in Europe, aiming for France to take the lead in filling the void left by the Americans. President Macron is not acting dishonestly or selfishly, as he is considering France's long-term self-interests, similar to how the US prioritizes its own. When interests align, as Mr. Macron stated, there will be no other solid ally to the US than France. However, this is not an unrealistic expectation, as nation-states negotiate their priorities with each other to achieve peaceful existences. Mr. Macron will face challenges in persuading other European countries to embrace the French vision in the midst of turbulent times in Europe. His tone-deaf statements about the role of French troops in several African nations, as well as his attempt to turn concerns about social media influence in government into a personal attack on Elon Musk, have not helped his case. We hope that the controversy surrounding the speech and the drama in the National Assembly won't divert the core message of finding a way forward to seek peace in Ukraine.